You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast hosted by Matt Franks.
And Zach Bechtold. And today we have a very special guest with us. First time doing a podcast from across the pond, which is really fun for us. We have David Worthington, who is the global ambassador of Methodist Heritage Sites and the General Commission on Archives and History of the United Methodist Church. David, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Matt. It's lovely to be here with you both. I think it might be the longest role title within the United Methodist Church, but try fitting that onto a form. It just doesn't work. But lovely to be here with you and looking forward to our time together.
Yeah, thank you. I imagine your business card's like a 3.5 by 5 inch.
Well, Zach, these days, of course, it's all digital, isn't it?
That's true. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank God for the little dot cards, right?
Spot on.
Love it. Well, David, would you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I suppose my journey with Methodist Heritage started about 20 years ago when I was appointed as the manager of John Wesley's new room in Bristol, England, the city that I live in and continue to live in to this day. At that time, the chapel was looking to appoint a manager to essentially oversee the celebrations that were scheduled for the Charles Wesley tercentenary. The trustees invited people to apply, and at the end of the process, for better or worse, they decided to offer me the role, which I was very grateful to accept. I was in that role for 16 years in total, during the course of which we did deliver the two projects that the trustees wanted me to. In one of our courtyards, there's a beautiful statue of John Wesley on horseback, and we created a garden area. And in the other courtyard, which had the beautiful statue of Charles Wesley, we created what we called the Horse Fair Project, which saw a 3-story building basically inserted into a courtyard. Charles moved a little further to the front of the site so that he was in a position to welcome people even better than being in the middle of a courtyard. But I think what emerged during my time in the role was I felt as I had a real connection with our international visitors, and in particular those coming in from the United States. Just to give you some background, I have a degree in international relations, and I specialized on the relationship between Britain and the United States. So it's something that's always been very dear to me, this sort of relationship between us across the pond. And lots of people responded very positively to the talks that I shared in the chapel. Very significant building, the oldest Methodist building in the world, dating from 1739. As I would often, whether half joking or half serious, you can decide, but I would say, well, we are welcoming you as from the colonies to the new room this morning. 1739, you can do the maths. So people were very kind and said, look, we love what you've shared with us. If you ever find yourself in the US, then we'd love to host you at our church. Or I've spoken at conference offices, heritage sites, lots of other locations. And back in 24, I stepped away from my full-time role and thought, well, let's pursue this idea of working with the Americans. That's when I had a conversation with Ashley Bogan in her capacity as the General Secretary for the agency. And since 24, I've been delivering in this role as the Global Ambassador. What that essentially means is I undertake 2 speaking tours per year, normally about a month at a time. And I also am often the person that welcomes those international groups when they come to the new room. In addition, we also have the Charles Wesley House. So I'm a host and a guide, and also hopefully, maintaining contacts going on between the UK and the US in terms of the significance of our Wesleyan heritage story and making sure that people on both sides of the Atlantic understand not only how significant the work is that the Wesleys began in Britain in the 18th century, but really more critically, how do we take that learning and apply it with the challenges that we face on both sides of the Atlantic, whether it's the British Methodist Church or the United Methodist Church, in terms of what are we seeking to do and to be as Methodists today. My good friend Bishop Tom Bickerton, of course the Bishop in New York and New England, talked when he was chair of the Council of Bishops how we need to reclaim our identity as Methodists. And I've said to Bishop Tom, that's a great phrase. Of course, it does make the assumption that we have actually claimed our Methodist identity in the first place. Because from my experience, both in the UK and the US, I think there is maybe an assumption that the understanding of what it means to be Wesleyan is perhaps not as widely understood as we might perceive it to be. And I think if there's anything I can do in this role, if it's about raising awareness of the Wesley story and challenging us in terms of what is it that we're doing to take this story forward. I often conclude my talks by offering what can often be seen as a mic drop moment. It might seem very obvious, but I sort of just say to folks, look, I've been sharing with you about John and Charles Wesley, but I have to tell you that both of these men are now dead. And as a result, the responsibility is now passed to others. At which point I will say, and who are those others? To which, of course, the penny drops and everybody says, well, that's us. Well, in which case, who's going to take our story forward? Because if it ain't you and it ain't me, then it ain't nobody, if you pardon my grammar.
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
And, what will folks write about the Methodists in the 21st century, the early part of the 21st century, where they look back and have nothing to say because there is no church.
Right.
And again, a phrase that I often use is, I don't believe that God is finished with the people called Methodists. My sincere hope is that the people called Methodists are not finished with God. I think that's a challenge.
I think so too. I love that.
So, when you ask that question, like, how do people typically respond to that? Because I would love to hear if you've had any response to that. What was that sound like?
Well, in some respects, I'm in a fortunate position when I share, particularly in the new room in Bristol, because I would argue that even if you're a person of no faith and you come into that space, there is a real sense of it being a sacred space. And in that sense, what happens is that I think that you are already in an advantageous position to talk about the need for us to adopt a Wesleyan stance, a Wesleyan theology, whatever phrase you want to use, in terms of what is it that the Wesleys did in the 18th century that engaged with a society that we ourselves would often bemoan the fact that somehow people today, they just don't want to hear the story, they don't want to engage with us, etc. But these are exactly the same challenges that the Wesleys and the early Methodists faced in the 18th century. And therefore, I think that's why it's so critical that we need to understand our story to then extract the lessons of how the Wesleys approached it, to then give us some clues about how we tackle the challenges we face today. That does not mean that we adopt the same solutions that the Wesleys did, but it does mean that we are prepared. And again, we talked about Ashley, her book that she published last year, Wesleyan Vitality. The word vile comes from a phrase that John Wesley used in his journal when he preached in Bristol in the open air for the very first time. He talked about, I submit to be more vile, to preach in the open air for the very first time. Why did he use that phrase? Well, the answer to that is that he was an ordained high Anglican minister, very well educated, who could have spent all of his ministry in the gleaming spires of Oxford. He was a fellow appointed at Lincoln College. And yet he turns his back on that world and says, I need to engage with the poor, the disenfranchised, the hard to reach. These are the people that I should be engaging with. And I think that those give us some clues as to why, as a Methodist church today, we should be prepared to go back to adopting that radical nature of what the Wesleys did in the 18th century. They were constantly challenged by both secular authorities and religious authorities. And in that sense, I think if we are not challenging the authority of those around us in some respects, we're probably not doing what we should be doing. So I think that the lessons to be learned from the Wesleys are we don't adopt exactly the same solutions to the challenges we face, but we do say we are prepared to do things in a different way to the way that society expects us to do it. And if we feel as though there is no resistance coming back to us because of the way in which we are conducting our lives and our ministry, then maybe there's a question to be asked, which is, am I actually doing ministry in the way that I think God is calling me? There's a wonderful quote, and you will both know this very well. Wesley is an eminently quotable gentleman. I don't think he necessarily sat down looking for sound bites, but he certainly came up with them. And like most preachers, we all love the sound of our own voices, and I could spout on for probably far too long about all things Wesley. But one phrase that I consistently come back to illustrate the points that I'm making with you now and with groups when they visit or when I go and speak at churches. I think most people are familiar with the Wesley quote, I look upon all the world as my parish. What not many people are aware is the context of the quote. And it actually comes from a letter which John Wesley wrote to the Bishop of Bristol in 1739, when the bishop had written to him to say, why are you here in the parish of Bristol? I have not invited you here. You have no commission to be in my diocese. My best advice to you, therefore, is to go. Now, I'm not an ordained pastor. I've never received a letter from the bishop along those lines, and I suspect that there aren't too many clergy who've had those sort of letters. But again, how did John Wesley respond to that? Did he write back and say, I'm deeply sorry to have upset you, Bishop. Let me leave town. Forget I ever arrived. No, he came back with words which are eminently quotable. Sir, I look upon all the world as my parish. That's a great quote. Although, of course, as we know, Wesley only made the one trip over to America and never returned after his rather interesting sojourn in Georgia.
It's a very nice way to put it.
Yeah. Sorry, you want to talk about Sophie Hopkey now?
Please.
Just as a quick aside, I've spoken in Savannah a couple of times and I wasn't chased out of town. So I do hope that the city council contact me and say, where would you like your statue to be placed within one of the many squares within Savannah? Because if you're prepared to put one in for John, who left under a cloud, then surely you've got one scheduled for me. Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
Anyway, so the reply, I look upon all the world as my parish. Powerful words. But what he then goes on to say, in my humble opinion, is maybe the most significant statement of all. And it's one which just doesn't seem to do the rounds in the way that one would expect. But it's there, trust me. Wesley says, Sir, I look upon all the world as my parish. He then continues, and bearing in mind this was written just 3 months after his arrival in the city of Bristol. He writes these words. He says, this is the work which I know the Lord has called me to, and faithful am I in fulfilling what he has given me to do. Now, if we just break that sentence down for a moment, can we, in our heart of hearts, say, what I do, this is the work which I know the Lord has called me to? I hope we can answer yes to that question. The second part, in many respects, is that greater challenge. How do I seek to be faithful in fulfilling that work that God has given me to do? And I think that if you can answer, yes, this is the work which I know the Lord has called me to, and yes, I'm being faithful, my answer to that is, you carry on, my friend. You continue to do the work. But, ask yourself, search inside yourself, is this the work which you believe God has called you to? Mm-hmm. Because I suspect that John Wesley, when he arrived in Bristol, did not seek to then become known as an itinerant preacher. It was said he wasn't a particularly good or strong or powerful preacher. You probably know George Whitefield was known as the great orator of Methodism. John Wesley's genius, of course, was creating the structures that allowed the movement to have roots and to develop, with class meetings, bands, societies, etc. So from that point of view, I think that we must always recognize that John Wesley, the story is a story we know well, but we know it, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Mm-hmm. The Wesleys, both John and Charles, in my humble opinion, Charles is not recognized in any way, shape, or form. Methodism was born in song. Mm-hmm. Without Charles's hymnody, many people who were illiterate would not know their Bible. If you're saying who was the genius of the Methodist movement, well, to give you a cheat of an answer, the truth is both. But without Charles's significant contribution, not just as a hymn writer, but as an itinerant preacher in those early years, Charles's role needs to be recognized as far more significant than, oh, he wrote some hymns, didn't he? Mm-hmm. And there's something to be said for the church beginning to wake up from its slumbers about, oh, well, yeah, John was the leader and Charles was the hymn writer. Mm-hmm. But just to conclude the point, what John says in that letter to the Bishop of Bristol is, I think, words which guide him for the rest of his life. Mm-hmm. And I think he was clear, following his experiences in Bristol, engagement with some really, really difficult sections of society that everyone else had written off and wanted nothing more to do with, to then be able to turn around and say, this is the work which I know the Lord has called me to, and faithful am I in fulfilling what he's given me to do, I think is such a powerful statement and essentially defines the man and his ministry for the next 50 years.
Yeah. Two kind of reflections. One I've appreciated, and you just named it, talking about the Wesleys plural, right? And you're exactly right. We we put John and Charles in their little boxes and tell their stories that way. In 100% we don't give Charles enough credit. He's a cute little songwriter or whatever. But so significant in his story and the story of the movement of the Methodists. But, Whitfield and others, they didn't do it alone, right? And the ways in which John built community and structure, huge, right? And naming and leaning on that very thing of this is who we are. We don't do this alone. We've never done this alone. I think is huge in our story and moving forward and telling that story better.
And I think one of the other significant things, again, which the UMC I think would do well to reflect on, and I think it is, obviously we know John and Charles and George Whitfield as ordained Anglican ministers. That is correct. However, there were only so many of those ministers that were prepared to challenge the authority of the Anglican Church at that time. Wesley realized very quickly, and therefore put the networks in quickly, to develop lay leadership. And I think that the UMC would do well today to think about how do we empower our lay people to take responsibility for leadership. Not necessarily that they are usurping the authority of the pastor, but certainly my experience of dealing with many hundreds of pastors over the last 20 years, many of them would value having support, wisdom, people that they can call on, that they can rely on to help them. I think we've become too much of a culture which receives. What do I want? Well, the bang for my buck is that I come on Sunday, I get a good sermon, I get a nice sing along, I see the choir performing great music, and they can have my tithe or however much they choose to contribute. That in and of itself, I'm not seeking to make that a criticism. But I do find it interesting that when you look at the mission statements of the United Methodist Church, doesn't talk about members, it talks about disciples. Now, you both will understand, of course, that there is a very significant difference between being a member of an organization and being a disciple. And I just wonder whether or not it's about time we told some home truths about we're seeking to make disciples, and this commitment to discipleship is one that will cost you. It may well be that you'll continue in your lay role doing what you do, but there are commitments that you will give that will take you into areas that, outside your comfort zone. That's exactly what Wesley was saying. I submit to be more vile, to use a modern term. I'm stepping outside my comfort zone. I'm prepared to do it. Why? Because I believe that this is what God wants me to do.
Well, that leads into my second reflection of talking about the world as my parish, right? Like I've said that plenty. I know every Methodist clergy has said that for a variety of reasons. And it's that second part, right? Often, like our mission statement in the Book of Discipline, we're called to make disciples, but the place we do that is our community, the local congregation. So that's the most vital part of that.
Yeah.
And I think on both of those, we miss the boat when we don't lean into the second statement, right? Sure, the world is your parish, but what are you doing? Why are you called there? Knowing that. In knowing that well, knowing the discipleship piece well and why we're called to our communities helps us build up lay leadership, helps us make disciples, helps us build these connections and communities up well. But so often we walk into them just remembering the first part. well, the world is my parish, so I'm here. I'm called to make disciples, so I'm here. But at what rate? At what point? How do we do that? Where do we do that? And do we know how and why we're called to those moments and those places and those communities? And often, I don't know that we do. I think we forget that part, or we're caught up in the nuance of, well, the bishop told me I moved, and I serve at the pleasure of the bishop, and here I am. And it's tough. That's part of who we are, and I think you're exactly right. Leaning back into those, into the rationale, into the meat of those statements, and why they're said, and why we lean into them. We have to. We have to do that, and we have to do it well each and every time.
Yeah, and I think if you're not known within your local community, if to put it very blunt terms, if all you're doing is serving your members, then that really is not what your calling is. You should be known by the mayor, the chief of police, the retailers, the third sector organizations, charities, you know, the homeless shelter. They should know who you are. And at the risk of sounding like I'm condemning people, if you are not known within those areas of your local community, then quite frankly, what are you doing? Because if all you're doing is essentially you're cosplaying as a pastor, and you are serving people who are saved, but I think Christ's ministry demonstrates to us that we go out and we find out those who we should be engaging with outside of the comfort zone. And I think that, yeah, if it's all about respectability, then quite frankly, you're in the wrong game. You need to be willing to submit to be more vile, to get out of your comfort zone, to engage with sections of society that your morals, values you may not feel comfortable with that. But if you truly believe that, and again, we could talk about the Wesley covenant prayer, put me to what you will. If you are prepared to make that covenant prayer, and certainly within the British Methodist Church, that's often done at the beginning of the year. I'm sure it's the same in the US. Before you make those statements, perhaps it would be worth spending some time reading through and just reflecting on what am I actually saying here? Because too often I think we can just repeat something and not really reflect on, wow, there's some pretty heavy stuff within this covenant prayer. And do I really believe it? Would I really be prepared to follow through on, put me to what you will? And again, I'm not seeking to condemn anybody. I know that we all have our own personal set of circumstances. But I think we should all take the opportunity to reflect on what those words mean, and are we living them out? Again, just a quick example to share with you. At the new room in Bristol, we have a double pulpit. Probably a practical thing because of space. So the lower pulpit was reserved for the reading of the Bible and leading of worship. Charles would have heard some of his hymns sung at the new room for the first time. Upper pulpit reserved for the preacher. Now you can imagine that one of the favourite photographs that visitors like to take is, I'm stood in the new room's pulpit, I'm preaching the word. I've taken to now saying, folks, you are very welcome to go and stand in that pulpit and have your photograph taken. The caveat is, if all you're going to do is put that on your social media platforms and say, hey, I visited the new room, and it has no impact upon your life and your ministry, then really all you've done is be a tourist. Nothing wrong with being a tourist, but don't pretend that by standing in John Wesley's pulpit and having your photograph taken, that somehow your ministry has been blessed just because you put it on a social media platform. The irony, and many people have said this to me, they often think coming to the new room is almost like, coming back home, to the roots of Methodism. And there is some truth in that statement. Of course there is. But what they're often surprised about is when I say to them, now I've finished sharing with you, you are now ambassadors to take this story out. You are being commissioned to share these words. I cannot be in every location around the world sharing these stories. You will go back to Colorado, California, New Jersey, Brazil, Australia, Germany, wherever it is. And you are to be the salt and light within your communities. Reflect on what the Wesleys did and ask yourself, what is God now asking of me in the community in which I'm located today? Not what would John Wesley ask me to do? What's God asking me to do? Because again, it might sound a bit odd coming from the global ambassador, but the Wesley brothers were flesh and blood. They made mistakes. They were not perfect. There is much to learn from their lives and their ministry, absolutely. But do not get mixed up that somehow the Wesleys are our saviour, because they're not. It's their faith in Jesus, and I hope our faith in Jesus. He's our saviour, not John Wesley, Charles Wesley, or any other of the early Methodists. They were inspired in their faith through the promptings of the Holy Spirit to do what they did. But ultimately, this is about serving God through our relationship with Jesus to allow us to be salt and light in the world, to be a beacon. Again, we're all very familiar with the language that is used. So don't stand in that Wesley pulpit unless you're prepared to get your hands dirty.
I love that. Because every year I see people throwing things up, and that is going to change how I see those pictures, and maybe how I respond on the Facebook of, now what are you doing? Did you hear what was asked of you?
Yeah. Well, I always find it interesting that if you ask a very generic question, do you want to see revival? Who's going to keep their hand down and say, no, I'm quite happy with the status quo?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, everybody says, yeah, I want to see revival. So who's responsible for revival? I'm still looking at you.
Right.
Who is responsible for revival? Because, it sounds so obvious, doesn't it? But sometimes we just need these reminders, There's a plaque to the Wesley brothers in Westminster Abbey in London. You probably know many of the famous, well-known are buried or have plaques and monuments in Westminster Abbey. The Wesley brothers have a plaque. There are 3 quotes, 2 from John and 1 from Charles. I won't ask you to guess the John ones because you'll get the first 2, but I look upon all the world as my parish. The best of all is that God is with us. Fine quotes, no issue with that. 1 quote from Charles Wesley. You would have thought it would be a line from one of those thousands of hymns which Charles wrote. It's not. It's from a letter. And again, I'm not seeking to be dismissive of John Wesley and his ministry, but when you hear this come from Charles in this letter, you'll think, this man needs to be recognized for his contribution, not just to the hymn writing, but to the movement overall. Charles wrote, God buries his workers, but carries on his work. And I think that's so powerful because essentially God is carrying on his work. Whether we choose to be engaged with that work, that is a choice. And when we ask, where is revival? Well, revival's in your hands, my friend. How badly do you want it? Are you willing to become a disciple of Jesus? Or are you quite content with the status quo and being a member of a denominational church? And I'm not criticizing those who are a member of a denominational church, but I am asking the question, are you fulfilling what God has given you to do in your life?
And that's a good that'll preach. And I definitely think that that's a good way of, especially like, when people come to your sites and things, like hearing that kind of thing, it changes the way that I would see it changing the way that people would come back from the sites in a different way, and not just necessarily in a touristy way that maybe that wasn't what they were expecting, but yet they also like, oh wow, like we were challenged for revival, and now we need to figure out what that looks like. I definitely think that that's we just had a this I just got to this appointment in July, and we had a group go go to the Wesley sites, I think a couple weeks ago, and just hearing from their stories about what they experienced, you can kind of see that was um, you could kind of feel that from them. And then the church that I was serving, they're doing a Wesley tour in late October, and so I'll be intrigued to see how they respond on their social media. And like Zach said, when people post those pictures or show those things, it's gonna make I know I'm gonna look at that differently now than most, and I think it's a hefty challenge to think about when we're in those spaces, about what are we going to do about knowing this information now, and what can we learn from that to, have people write about us 250, 300 years after the fact. I think that's definitely a good space to create for that.
Yeah, and I'm acutely aware that we have a finite amount of resources and time available to us, but I really believe that if we are going to build on firm foundations, then they have to be built on our understanding of Wesleyan theology, but not just theology. And I'm conscious that I'm on a Bearded Theologians podcast. It's often said John Wesley had a very flexible theology. But I think that we can sometimes get lost in the long grass. And I think there are occasions when actually it's pretty straightforward what we should be doing. In the way that Wesley responded to the needs of the community around him, he created a schoolhouse. He created a dispensary for free medicines. He offered a food bank, or a food pantry, I think you would say in the US. In other words, I can preach to these folks and I can ask them to repent of their sins and turn to Christ. But if that's all I'm going to do, and I'm going to leave them in a destitute state, then I really am just a hollow gong. I've got to be prepared to say, what is it that I can assist you with here, brother? How can I help you, sister, on your journey? And I think, and of course, Methodists, I know both here in the UK and the US, are often sort of mocked for, offering crock pots and that sort of hospitality. But again, you're probably familiar with Garrison Keillor, the American author, that you can always rely on a Methodist. And it may not be sort of perceived as super exciting, but there is a firm foundation that society can exist on because of the Methodists. And that is even more true within the United States. Again, as I'm sure you both know, you cannot write the history of the United States without writing the history of American Methodism. We know about George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. People like Francis Asbury were better known than all of those three men. Why? Because they were itinerant preachers out and about, engaging with people in their own communities. Again, I'm not here to be critical of the founding fathers. I know Washington did make a special point of getting out to visit as many of the states when he became president. Franklin, of course, spent huge amounts of time both in England and France. But the reality is that much of what you would consider to be founding principles and founding documents are built on many of the ideas of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, but also, of course, on a sense in which a providential God. And this isn't the time to get into the debates about what George Washington's faith or Thomas Jefferson's faith, but the point being that from the start of the Republic, it has been grounded in an understanding about having a care and a concern for others. I often make the observation, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but in Washington, D.C., there are two statues to early Methodist preachers. One is at the Wesley Theological Seminary in D.C. It's a copy of the equestrian statue that we have at the New Room in Bristol. The other one is of Francis Asbury. And it's unveiled by President Coolidge in the 1920s with the words, "Asbury deserves to rank as one of the builders of our nation, the United States." Now, I've often posed the question, particularly when bishops are in the room, anybody think that there'll be a statue unveiled to them in years to come? But just think about that. An Englishman called Francis Asbury comes over to America with a ministry, and that ministry is richly blessed and has a huge impact upon religious understanding within the United States. And 200 years on, a statue is unveiled to him in Washington, D.C. by none other than the incumbent president. Now, I don't suppose they've probably got much room left. Too many other statues have been put up recently. But, isn't that significant that there is Asbury recognized by the president for his contribution? And I think, again, just little stories, both Asbury and Thomas Coke, who, of course, the first two bishops of American Methodism, went to petition George Washington when he was still a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses around the issue of slavery. Now, again, as you probably know, George Washington was the only founding father who had his slaves released upon his death. Is there a connection between those two? Maybe, maybe not. Of course, Martha's slaves weren't released, but that's another story. But I think it's significant that these early Methodist preachers, they clearly had an impact upon the political classes of their time. They were respected for what they did. And I think it's just an interesting juxtaposition, because many people from the US say to me, "Oh, we don't have much history, we don't have much heritage compared to you in England." Well, in some respects, that's true. Ours goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, but you've now got 250 years worth of it. And in that sense, Methodism predates the Republic. Methodism was over in America before the War of Independence. And many of those documents, of course, were essentially archives that were kept by Methodist historians. So even if you claim to have no interest in Methodism, if you claim to have an interest in American history, you will by default know who people like Francis Asbury, Thomas Cope, George Whitefield were. It might sound strange, but for an Englishman, that's fascinating to me. Absolutely fascinating that the founding fathers that you hold up and revere, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be revered, but I think you could quite legitimately include many of those early Methodist preachers as being as significant in the founding of the Republic as those founding fathers which many people know. So even if you don't think there's a way into telling this story because this person isn't a believer or professes to have no belief, even if they've got only a modicum of interest in the early Republic, you've got a great story. I would still love the opportunity to have a chat with Bruce Springsteen and say to him, your debut album is called Greetings from Asbury Park. Now, Bruce, do you know why it's called Asbury Park? Now, he seems to be a very spiritually aware gentleman. So I'd like to think that he does, you know. But again, look for the opportunities to talk about how significant these people are in the Republic, whether it's Asbury, Whitefield, etc., you know.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing, sorry, just quickly to finish off, and something that I think Ashley, in her role as the General Secretary, is doing a great job, which is, I think too much of our American Methodist history has been focused on telling the good stories, the ones that make our hearts strangely warmed. What they've not done is focus on those bad stories and the ugly stories. And if all you're going to do is tell the good stories, then what you're actually telling are myths. We need to be prepared and understand how Methodists impacted negatively on issues around race, around issues of sexuality, around issues of engagement with Native Americans. And I believe it's only through acknowledging that and seeking ways of working with those communities that we are really going to see a sense of sort of understanding of how these communities can now function and work together. And again, I am seeking to be respectful. I am an Englishman commenting on a situation in a foreign land, but I truly believe that America needs to come to terms with its history that is not pretty. And it concerns me deeply, and I suspect it does you, that the current administration seem to be on a deliberate path of trying to shut down many of the stories which are harrowing, uncomfortable, challenging to a narrative of white patriarchs. I hope when I get to the US border later this month that they won't ask me to speak too much about the current administration, because I suspect at that point I'll be declined entry. But one would like to think that the First Amendment holds true, that I do have the right to express my view, in the way that we all have a right to express our view. And why? Because essentially the early Methodist preachers said that God has a love, a care, and a compassion for each and every person. No exceptions, each and every person, all created in the image of God. Whether you agree or disagree with people's views, opinions, thoughts, you should at the very least give them the opportunity to express themselves. And so from that point of view, I think, again, that is rooted in that early Methodist story of going out and giving poor, disenfranchised people, women, those who were enslaved, a voice. And I think that maybe one of the challenges for all of us within the church is how do we make sure that those voices continue to be heard moving forwards?
And I think you're exactly right. Naming and owning the harm that's been caused, all in the name of God through our very own movement.
Yeah,
We do a lot of begun to do a lot of work in our area with the Sand Creek Massacre
yeah,
and things like that. And then in Montana, we have a good and bad relationship, right? We've
yeah,
had some really good things come out of early circuit riders and the indigenous communities and things like that. And having the both and naming the harm that's been caused and working for that healing. Because if we don't, if we just ignore it, you're exactly right. We just continue to cause harm and continue to sweep things under the rug and not live into who we've been and where we're going. And
yeah.
we'll just keep being stagnant and stale and wondering who is going to pick up this revival before us.
Yeah, and again, I'm sure we all reflect on our own journeys of faith,
Mhm.
and the reality is that all of us at some point have to acknowledge that we have sin
Mhm.
in our life and that we are seeking to repent of that sin and seeking to do better, to be better. But I genuinely believe that in order for you to be able to embark on that journey, there needs to be an acknowledgement that the way in which I have lived my life up to this point has fallen far short of the glory of God,
Mhm.
and that opportunity for restoration of a relationship is one which I actively want to pursue. And again, eminently quotable Mr. Wesley, um, the Bible knows nothing of solitary religion. In other words, you can't do this on your own, folks. And therefore, I think we need to acknowledge that we need to be living within community,
Mhm.
whether that's in a physical sense, a digital sense, who knows? I'm not prescribing, I'm just saying we have to be part of a community.
Mhm.
The other thing, and again, you'll probably be familiar with it, Wesley said there's no such thing as a half Christian. In other words, you can't just dip your toe in the water
Mm.
and, pretend that, I've got all of the trappings of the Christian faith. I go to church and I, attend this and go to that. You're either in this, or to put it bluntly, you're not. In other words, there is no halfway house. It's either full commitment with all of the potential challenges that may come from that full commitment, or you are literally just paying lip service.
Mm.
And that's a really, you know thought-provoking challenge, isn't it?
Mhm.
Am I really committed to this, or is it, well, it's something which I think I should, but I'll take that bit and that bit, but I really don't want that bit, and that bit, thank you very much. um and again, just so it's very clear, I'm not for one moment saying that my own life is
Right.
perfect
Right.
and that
Right.
I've got everything right. And I'm sure, and I know this acutely when I was the director, because the trustees a few years then put me as a director because I then had a staff team to look after. I was acutely aware that I was reporting to those trustees about the work that I was doing and seeking their approval for it. But it's a real challenge when you're essentially working in a building that John Wesley built and designed in the 18th century. And he could quite legitimately say to me, so what is it you're doing with that building today, David?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're the director, it's your responsibility. What are you doing? There's no point in me stuttering and stammering and saying, yeah, you know, what am I doing? And that's a real challenge.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what am I doing? So, you know, much of what I've said, of course, is very much pointed directly at myself, as opposed to somehow thinking that everybody else needs to up their game and try
Right.
and get to my level.
Right.
I'm not for one moment claiming that. What I am saying is, let's work together here as a community.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why this word connection keeps coming up within Methodism,
Mm-hmm.
because we are connected. We're in a faith relationship with each other and with God.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really powerful. There's a lovely quote from Bishop Desmond Tutu. He said, I know I'm going to be surprised when I get into heaven, because there's so many people I'm going to meet there that I don't think should be there.
Yeah.
You know, what an interesting observation. We've got our own views, haven't we? Oh yeah, you know, he's doing good work, she's doing good work. I'm not quite sure, you know.
Not sure about that. Yeah.
No? But isn't that wonderful that basically God can, you know, embrace such a wide, you know, section of folks who've basically said, yeah, put
Yeah.
me to what you will,
Yeah.
answer that covenant prayer. And I just think that's sort of really powerful. And, you know, ultimately, it's about wanting to remain in relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, the question may have been asked of you as pastors, you know, what does heaven look like? What's it going to be like? And, you know, I think certainly as a young Christian, you know, you try and offer some sort of worldly definition of it. But I think over the years, I've said, I've no idea what heaven is like. All I know is I'm going to continue to be in relationship with God. That's all I'm worried about.
Mm-hmm.
How that manifests itself, not my worry. But the prospect of that relationship with God being terminated, that would be something that would just be beyond sort of comprehension. So, you know, I think that as such, it's not about aspiring to be in heaven at some point. It's about we're in heaven now because we're in relationship with God. What is it I can do now that's going to continue that relationship, as opposed to, well, if I do this and do that and I can tick that box and cross that thing off, then yeah, it's all going to be good, you know, come the day of judgment. It's like, well, if you're worried about what the day of judgment looks like, then you're probably not actually coming at it from the right perspective, you know. This should just be like opening a door and saying, oh, hi, good to see you, you know. It shouldn't be this, oh, that's what you look like, oh, that's what it's going to be like, you know. It's just like, okay, well, yesterday was yesterday and today is today, and tomorrow will be tomorrow. And I think that's, for me, that's become more and more powerful as I've got older, that sense in which my brain doesn't have any capacity to try and even work out what heaven looks like. So let's just go with, it's just an ongoing relationship with God.
Yeah, I love that. We want to be good stewards of your time, David. But I do have, if you have a couple more minutes to spare, you've told some beautiful stories about early Methodism and John and Charles and those folks. But do you have a favorite story? Matt and I talk a lot about and have done a couple of podcasts on the primitive physic, just because it's a fascinating chapter in John's life. But is there anything that's kind of fun, kind of a fun fact, fun story that you always like to share about any of the early Methodists or John or Charles or whomever?
Yeah, you'll indulge me because I've probably got two, maybe three, depending how long they take. So you talked about primitive physic. Shortly after it was published, it was reviewed in a London newspaper by an eminent doctor of the time who was extremely critical of it and said John Wesley has no formal training as a doctor. This is nothing more than quack medicine. As a result of this review, sales of the book increased. So Wesley then wrote a letter to the newspaper to say, concerning the dear doctor's review, I wish to advise him that sales have increased as a result of the review. If he wishes to review any more of my publications, then he is most welcome.
That's awesome. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
One other one to share with you. Bristol is based in or located in the west of England. We're about 15 miles from the UNESCO heritage city of Bath. Bath in the 18th century was probably the Vegas of England. The gentlemen went to play cards and gamble. The ladies went to take the waters, but really just to gossip. Probably the epitome of Bath in the 18th century in terms of that lifestyle was a gentleman called Beau Nash. And Beau Nash was very critical of Wesley and the early Methodists. And on one occasion, he challenged Wesley as to why he was preaching, to which Wesley replied, "Do you not want to hear me preach, or do you judge me by reputation?" The next story may be apocryphal, but it's a great story all the same. Wesley and Nash were walking along the side of a river, walking towards each other. Somebody was going to have to step aside in order for the other person to pass. Beau Nash says to John Wesley, "Sir, I do not give way to fools." To which Wesley, as he stepped into the muddy bank, said, "But I do, sir."
That's great. I'm gonna use that on Matt next time we're clergy orders or annual conference. We're just gonna
Yeah. So if anybody says to you John Wesley did not have a sense of humor, then I would shut that argument down very quickly, because
for sure.
I mean, clearly he was a very intelligent man and was therefore, I'm sure, able to think very quickly. But, Beau Nash and the eminent doctor got a good tongue lashing from Mr. Wesley.
They sure did. Love it. Thank you.
Well, David, we definitely want to thank you for your time. And I hope that your time here in the Mountain Sky Annual Conference and other places that you have to go are fruitful. And I hope you get to catch a couple of games of baseball as well. We're definitely thankful for your time. We will have a link to whatever you want to link. Just email Zach and we'll get that up in our show notes. But listeners, we're definitely grateful for you. And so don't forget to like us and share us and connect with us at beardedtheologians.com. And so for the Bearded Theologians, I'm Matt Franks.
I'm Zach Bechtold. Thanks for checking us out.
And like this video. And push that thumbs up.
Thank you for listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share on all social media outlets. You can check out old episodes and more information at beardedtheologians.com. Thanks for checking us out.